Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're having a conversation with TID's Aquatic Biologist. Across the 40 previous episodes of this podcast, we've covered a variety of unique topics and unique positions at the district, but there's still one you may be unfamiliar with, our aquatic biologist. TID's biologist studies the Tuolumne River, coordinates on district operations, and even spends a portion of his time in schools teaching the next generation all about the fishery. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Aquatic Biologist Pat Maloney to discuss the history, the day-to-day, and the varied tasks that fall under this unique position. Pat, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your background with the district?
Well, I was hired in 2012 by Bob Nees and Steve Boyd. They actually flew up to Humboldt. They were out recruiting fisheries biologists that would satisfy the district's needs for a fisheries biologist. And I had been working in resource extraction, where I was working for a big timber company. And as a biologist, that's sort of rare. And so they thought that I could fulfill their need here at the district as working as a biologist in another type of resource extraction where we have dammed up the river and supply irrigation water to our farmers, generate electricity. And I felt like I fit that niche pretty well myself. So when they offered me the position, I was here within 2 weeks.
Very good. Excellent. Now, I want to go back to, you said resource extraction. Can you kind of define that for us a little bit?
Sure. Resource extraction. So if you're drilling for oil, you're extracting a resource, but you can't just go and drill for oil and kill all the whales, can you? So you have to have biologists to oversee that type of operation. In timber industry, it's the same thing. There are bears and birds and plants and what have you, fish downstream of the timber operations that you've got to protect. So I fit that niche up in Humboldt. And here with the district, we've dammed up the river and we're supplying our farmers, our customers with irrigation water, and we've taken some of that water that the salmon would swim in. So we've got to do other things to enhance the salmon habitat.
Okay, so it's extracting that resource, but doing it in a responsible way that doesn't do harm to the environment.
That's my niche.
Okay, very good. All right, so I understand you were not the first biologist for TID, is that correct?
That's right. When I was hired, there were no biologists on staff. It had been a couple of years since they had a biologist. But prior to that, Tim Ford was here, I think, 25 or 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And he was a district employee. He had a cohort working alongside him, Steve Kirihara, who was a Stillwater Sciences employee, but here stationed at the district's office.
Okay. So what made you want to become a biologist in the first place?
Well, when I was a little kid, Mom and Dad used to take us up to Grandpa's cabin on Highway 4 in Arnold, and I think it was 5 or 6. Dad got called into a special project, and he couldn't go to the cabin.
Uh-oh.
So I remember standing in the kitchen, and Dad showing Mom how to put a worm on a hook. And he says, "You got to take the 3 little boys fishing." And me and my 2 little brothers stood and watched as Mom learned how to put a worm on a hook. It didn't scare her too bad. She was a nurse, but it wasn't a real girly thing, right? But she did it successfully, and she took us up to the cabin, and she took us fishing, and we filled a bucket full of bluegill, brought them back to the cabin and fried them up, and they were delicious. And
nice.
For me, that was it. The next day, I was down at Ace Hardware getting a mask and a snorkel. And then by the time I was 12, I had a paper out and was buying my own books on fisheries, aquariums, my own fishing gear, and I've been doing it ever since, really since I was 5 years old.
So could one say that from that point on you were hooked?
I was hooked.
Oh, sorry. I couldn't help myself. All right. So tell us a little bit about your work experience then prior to coming to TID.
So I've had 3 careers, actually.
Wow.
When I first got out of high school, I went to a junior college, and the junior college offered park management. They didn't offer fisheries biology, and so I took what I thought was the next best thing, the degree in park management. And that expanded into wildland firefighting, federal law enforcement, high-angle rescue.
Wow.
At the junior college level. I was fortunate to be able to take all those different types of courses and degrees. I must have 4 different junior college degrees. And then I put them to practice. I went to work for the city of San Jose as a park ranger. Fortunately, at the city of San Jose, I was able to work at the Japanese Friendship Garden and go to Japan for a couple of weeks and study at the sister city of Okayama at their Japanese garden, where they raise koi for 2,000 years. And so when I was back in San Jose, I was able to beautify the garden with the proper color flowers within the ponds, select the right koi for our ponds. And so fisheries was even involved in my park management days.
Sure.
And then I went to work for the feds and worked at some major national parks, such as Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, and Pinnacles National Monument down here by Hollister. And I spent 7 years bouncing around from park to park, doing high-angle rescue, backcountry patrol, firefighting, law enforcement.
Wow.
And then I ran into a law enforcement issue that kind of turned me off. I really wanted to teach people about the pine cones and the squirrels and the fish. And when somebody came into the park and brought their city troubles with them, and that's about the time I got out of park rangering. And
Okay, so that's career number 1 as a park ranger. And then what's number 2?
Number 2 is forestry. So as I moved up into Humboldt, I realized there were a lot of jobs in forestry. And so I was pretty good at the fisheries end of things, but I also thought I could do forestry because I had been a park ranger for so many years and was, I thought, very sure-footed in the woods, and I was. And I could read a map like nobody else, and I could move through the woods in treacherous terrain. And so I took a job in forestry for a decade and worked in Humboldt County and actually performed geology duties, 1,600 duties, which are applying for permits to do watercourse crossings and stream restoration.
Oh, wow.
In a forestry setting. And I love that position. However, the timber company went bankrupt. And so at that point in time, I went back and finished my 4-year degree in fisheries, which is when I got hired by TID.
Very good.
In fact, there were 2 weeks left in my final semester as a senior at Humboldt State University when Bob Nees and Steve Boyd hired me on. And it was kind of touch and go whether or not I was going to get the job because I wanted to finish my degree.
Sure, absolutely.
But they allowed me to finish the degree, and the very next day I was driving this direction.
Wow, very cool.
To start my 3rd career
here at TID.
Fisheries biology with TID.
Perfect. Good. Well, I'm glad that you finally got back to the fisheries side of things, and now we can reap the benefits of your knowledge in that area. So glad to have you here. All right, Pat. So we're just going to dive right in. So I know that one of your core functions here at TID is helping us fulfill the requirements of our FERC license. Can you start by telling us a little bit about that?
The fisheries studies that we conduct here at TID are mandated by our FERC license, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so we have to conduct these annual surveys with regard to the fishery on the Tuolumne River below LaGrange Dam. We report our findings to the FERC annually, and it takes more than just myself. We have consultants from Fish Bio and Stillwater Sciences helping us conduct these surveys. And some of the primary surveys that we conduct every year are adult salmon population counts, and we use a weir, which is basically a fence that has an opening with cameras and sonar in it, and it takes an image of every single Chinook salmon running upstream to spawn in the Tuolumne River, so we know their population size, we know how old they are, we know if they're male or female, and if they're a hatchery fish, just by the data from our weir that we install every September, just before the adults start migrating upstream to spawn in LaGrange.
Okay.
And then we also go out and we study where they spawn, the specific locations. What's the depth of the water there? What size cobble are they spawning in? What's the velocity of the water? So we can mimic these things later on when we go to do restoration. We know the proper velocity, depth, and cobble size, so we can recreate that in the field.
So kind of how to make that environment the most welcoming and enticing for the salmon.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
And so then we also study the juveniles. So once the adults have laid their eggs and they all perish, they'll sink to the bottom. The crawdads and the otters and what have you will gobble them up. Even
Circle of life.
the insects that the baby salmon come out of the gravel to eat also consume the dead carcasses of the adults. And so we study those juveniles. We have several different methods of trapping them. We catch them with seine nets, which is a weighted net, maybe 20 feet long with floats on the top. And two guys run through the river real quickly and net up the fish.
Wow.
And then we anesthetize them with, funny enough, with Alka-Seltzer.
Really?
Yes, Alka-Seltzer pushes the oxygen out of the water, so we throw an Alka-Seltzer tablet in a bucket, and the little baby salmon that we've captured fall right to sleep, which makes it easy to handle them without injuring them. And we can weigh them and measure them and release them.
Okay. And then they wake back up and you release them back to the river.
Back to the river. As soon as you put them back in river water without Alka-Seltzer, they wake right up.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And so we do this every Tuesday and Thursday throughout the system, not just in the Tuolumne, but all the way down to the San Joaquin as well, both upstream and downstream of the confluence. And so we get a really good idea of how fast they're growing. If you do this throughout the entire spring, you'll go to the same locations time after time, such as science. It's repetitive. And you find that they're growing at a certain rate every year. And so why? Why are they growing at a certain rate? Is it that there are more insects for them to eat this year? Is the water quality better this year than last? And that sort of thing. We also capture them in rotary screw traps, which are these giant funnel-like contraptions that folks that work over at the main yard may have seen them or helped to park them.
Okay.
They're 10 or 12 feet in diameter.
Oh, wow.
And 10 or 15 feet long, and they're giant funnel. And these funnels are placed out in the river. And as the baby salmon swim downstream, backwards, by the way,
Backwards.
they face upstream and they don't see where they're going. They go downstream backwards. And so they don't know they're going into the trap. And every morning we'll paddle out there in a kayak. And at the tail end of the funnel, there's a box where they're all trapped.
Okay.
And we net them out of there. And again, use the Alka-Seltzer to anesthetize them and weigh, measure, and release them.
Interesting. Wow. You've got a bunch of cool tools at your disposal.
We do use a lot of different tools that most people aren't accustomed to.
Sure.
We also snorkel for rainbow trout population. But while we're snorkeling, we go to, just like before with the seining, we go to the same locations over and over and over. And we document what species we're seeing other than rainbow trout and their size. But primarily the survey is focused on rainbow trout. We want to see what the rainbow trout population is doing annually. This year was, out of the last 12 years of snorkeling, I must say that this year was the best year for the rainbow trout population. Not only did we have 3/4-inch rainbow trout, but we had 1.25-inch rainbow trout. And what this is telling me is that there are 2 spawns happening this year.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I think what happened was they spawned before we did a spring pulse, and then they spawned after the spring pulse. And so we have 2 different size fish from this one very year.
Okay, interesting.
In addition to that, every single size class, all the way up to 5-pound rainbow trout, were extremely well represented throughout the entire system, all the way down to Waterford.
Oh, wow.
I was very shocked, actually, to see that many rainbow trout in the river. After 12 years of snorkeling, this was definitely the best year.
Okay, well, that's great. I want to touch on something that you mentioned real quick. You said that it seemed as though there was spawning prior to the spring pulse and then after the spring pulse. What do you mean when you say spring pulse? What does that look like?
Okay, so the spring pulse is calculated by the runoff coming off of the Sierra Nevadas. We use a B120 product, which is distributed through the state by the DWR, Department of Water Resources. And what that shows is the full natural flow or runoff from the mountains into the river. And that's how we calculate how much water goes into the river as a base flow and how much water is allowed for both a fall and a spring pulse. The spring pulse of water that we let down the river is usually much larger than the fall pulse, because what it's designed to do is carry those small juvenile fish from the headwaters of the Tuolumne in LaGrange all the way out to the San Francisco Bay.
Okay.
in mass. And so they're going backwards, as I stated before, and we flush them down the river to give them a fighting chance at making it all the way to the San Francisco Bay.
Okay.
And so, for instance, the base flow during a summer or in the early spring might be 300 cubic feet per second. That's like 300 basketballs of water moving past you every second. Mm-hmm. That's a fairly decent base flow. And then we'll jack the flow up to maybe 2,000 cubic feet per second.
Okay.
And really kind of flood the river and inundate some of the floodplains where those juveniles can get out into the floodplains and feed on insects, basically, that are being produced out in the shallow water of the floodplain.
So it really is that extra pulse of water down the river for environmental reasons that TID does just as part of us being good stewards and wanting to maintain a healthy river.
Yes, and we're actually mandated by our FERC license to run 10 different types of flow regimes based on the water year type.
Okay.
In order to facilitate those juveniles getting out to the ocean. The other pulse that we run is the fall pulse, and that's usually in October, right before the primary spawning season. And so what the fall pulse does, it's a much smaller volume of water, but what it does is it freshens the river. It knocks off all that algae that's been collecting on the gravel over the summertime. It hyperoxygenates the water in the river and chills it off a bit. And the fall pulse is generally 1,200 CFS maximum. 1,200 basketballs going by all in 1 second. And so those fish coming out of San Francisco Bay, they smell and taste and feel that hyperoxygenated cold water, and they follow it. And they follow it right up to LaGrange Dam.
Okay. Interesting.
And so those are the two primary pulses that we run. Most of the year, the rivers run pretty flat at what we call a base flow.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's get back to kind of all the rest of the duties that fall under your position. Tell us about kind of what some of the rest of those look like.
We have temperature studies on the river that are very important because our salmonids, so that's the fall run Chinook salmon, and oh my kiss, which are a rainbow trout or steelhead if they become anadromous, require very cold water. They require basically snowmelt. And so we're required to keep the river cold all the way down to Roberts Ferry Bridge to accommodate these species. And so we have thermographs deployed out in the river that record hourly temperature. They last about 5 years. So about every 5 years, we're out there replacing them. And we download the data every 6 months. And those thermographs start at the outflow of Don Pedro. They run all the way down the river to the confluence, 52 miles to the confluence of the San Joaquin River. And then we also have thermographs upstream and downstream on the San Joaquin River so that we know what kind of conditions the salmon are going into or coming from. Okay, very good. Hold on. You made me think of something here. For those who are unfamiliar, can you kind of paint us a picture of the Tuolumne River, of the areas specifically that you kind of keep watch over? What does that look like in terms of geography? The area that TID is responsible for begins at LaGrange Dam. Okay. So downstream of LaGrange Dam, the Tuolumne River flows freely all the way to the San Francisco Bay. And for 52 miles below LaGrange Dam, the Tuolumne River runs primarily by its lonesome. There is Dry Creek coming in at Modesto and a few other little tributaries, but it's basically 52 miles of Tuolumne River running down to the confluence of the San Joaquin River. The upper 15 or 20 miles of the Tuolumne River below LaGrange Dam are beautiful spawning and rearing habitat for salmonids. So what that looks like is cottonwoods and alders and willows along the banks. It looks like riffles with beautiful cobbles the size of baseballs and softballs across the river and gin-clear cold water. There are large boulders here and there for trout to eddy out behind and salmon to hide behind as well. But by the time you get down to Modesto, the river is really flat. Okay. As the river drops down into the valley, it slows down. And so you won't find large cobble down in Modesto. You'll find what we call the sand-bedded reach. So half of the 52 miles of river that we're responsible for is sand-bedded. And so salmonids use that area to travel. As adults run up from the San Joaquin to the spawning grounds, they pass through the sand-bedded reach really rapidly. Once they get to the cobble-bedded reach, they slow down and start looking for a place to spawn. The juveniles, on the other hand, find a lot more food in the gravel-bedded reaches because the invertebrates, the insects that lay their eggs in the water, their offspring love hiding in the gravel. And so that's a great habitat for juveniles to rear in. Once they get down into the sand-bedded reach, there's not as much food. And so they tend to travel a lot faster. There are also a lot more predators down there in the sand-bedded reach, such as largemouth bass and bluegill and striped bass and birds that can see them much more easily because it's a sand-bedded reach rather than a cobble-bedded reach.
Sure. So it's a fast passage, but also a bit of a treacherous one.
It can be very treacherous. We call it the gauntlet.
The gauntlet. Okay.
I like to talk about the snorkel survey because it really defines the two different sections of the river. The gravel-bedded reach up at the upper 15 or 20 miles of the river, you're going to find all kinds of rainbow trout and salmon, native fishes like Sacramento sucker, pike minnow. Those are native fishes. They're not most desirable fishes, but they're native, and they inhabit the upper section of river. And it's just much more beautiful to snorkel through the beautiful cobbles and large boulders and alders and cottonwoods on the banks. It's just more appealing to me than a valley, grassland, sand-bedded reach to snorkel, right?
All right. Well, thanks for that. Okay, so let's go back into a little bit more about TID's FERC license and kind of some of the requirements that are affiliated with that. So I think one of your responsibilities as it relates to that license is kind of coordination with different groups and quarterly meetings. Is that right?
That's correct. The FERC license mandates that we conduct quarterly meetings with the signatory agencies. So that would be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and some NGOs or nonprofit organizations who are environmentally inclined to assist in management of the river. And so, for instance, we have two major NGOs on the Tuolumne, and that's the Tuolumne River Trust and the Tuolumne River Conservancy. Not only do these folks attend the TAC meetings, Technical Advisory Committee meetings quarterly, but also landowners and just interested parties. We have consultants attending the meetings. Of course, Fish Bio, Stillwater Sciences, are primary consultants that assist me in gathering all the data that's required by FERC for the annual report. And so sometimes the meetings can number in 30 or 40 attendants. If there's a big subject coming up, so for instance, restoration of the spawning grounds, you might have 50 people at the meeting prior to a restoration project going off.
Interesting.
Everybody wants to give input, right?
Sure.
We're required to inform the group about flow operations. It's one of the primary things that everybody's concerned about is how much water is going down the river based on how much runoff did the DWR B120 bulletin says there is for that year. And how big is the pulse flow going to be and how are you going to shape it?
Okay.
Is it going to be 2,000 cubic feet per second? Is it going to last a week or 3 weeks? And that sort of thing.
Okay, so that's some of the topics that are discussed at the quarterly meetings.
Yeah. We also discuss the all of the data that's collected for the studies. So how many Chinook came up to spawn? Where did they spawn this year? How many adults are we seeing in Waterford versus down at Grayson? That sort of thing is discussed at the meetings. If anybody's got a specific topic they'd like to bring up, and they do, we'll discuss that and entertain
their questions. Yeah. Okay, very good. Now I want to jump back to, you mentioned that all of this data that's collected goes into the annual report. Can you tell us more about the annual report? Is that a requirement or?
It is a requirement. We do a little bit more than we're required to do.
Okay.
However, every year we're required to count the adults coming in, map out where they spawn, collect juveniles at both Waterford and Grayson, conduct seining. We voluntarily conduct the trout survey, the snorkel survey, But the temperature studies that we do play into every single study. And so somebody is crunching that temperature data and then plugging it into these various reports that all get compiled into a single report. Each report is an individual report that stands on its own. However, they're all sent in as a package to the FERC every year. And they number in about 500 pages. It's a pretty significant report.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's reviewed in-house by myself, Michael Cook, and we also send it out to our primary consultants for review to make sure that all our T's are crossed and I's are dotted.
Absolutely. Got all the accurate information in there.
It's posted on the FERC website, and it's available to the public, and also on the Fish Bio website, who house quite a bit of our data for us.
Very good. Now, I want to go back to the fish counting for a quick second, because I understand there are kind of some unique ways that happens. Can you tell us about those?
Sure. One of the best ways that we have to count adult salmon is with the weir. The weir, as I mentioned before, is a fence that crosses the entire river. It's stapled to the bottom of the river, and fish can't jump over it because the top end floats. And so there's no way around the weir, other than the hole in the center of the weir that we've created that allows passage upstream. And through that hole, there are motion sensors. And once they trigger the motion sensor, they get their photograph taken from the top, the bottom, the sides, and sonar as well. So if the river is muddy and it's nighttime, we still get an image of that fish. The sonar is so good, we can tell the age of the fish, its sex, whether it's a male or a female, and if it's from a hatchery.
Oh, interesting.
So on the backside of a salmonid, any salmon or trout, they have an adipose fin. It's kind of like your earlobe. It's a rubbery little fin with no bones, and it sits behind their dorsal fin, which has bones, kind of just in front of the tail. And at hatcheries in California, they do what's called constant fractional marking. So at a hatchery, if they have 1 million fish, juvenile baby salmon, they'll cut off 25% of those adipose fins.
Oh.
So you can imagine all of those fish coming back as adults 3-4 years later, and that's about how long they stay out in the ocean before they return to the river, they will have their adipose fins clipped off, 25% of them. So if you have 1,000 fish coming up your river and 250 of them have their adipose fin clipped off, you would know that all of your fish are from a hatchery.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay.
It meets the percent of constant fractional marking. And that's what we're seeing on the Tuolumne. We're seeing 25 to even 28% of the adults returning to the Tuolumne through the counting weir are marked that they're hatchery fish, which indicates to us that all of them are from a hatchery. We don't have a hatchery here on the Tuolumne.
Right.
So what we're receiving are other people's hatchery fish. They stray. So they're looking for the coldest, most oxygenated water, and many of them come to the Tuolumne.
Okay. We've got good water on the Tuolumne.
We do have some of the best water in all of California. It's protected at its headwaters at Yosemite National Park. A lot of our runoff comes from the park. So it's not Forest Service land where they're harvesting timber so much.
Okay.
It's more protected.
Interesting. Okay. Very good. So as part of your monitoring, I know that something that you're looking out for is turbidity. Can you tell us what turbidity is and how that kind of plays into the overall health of the river?
Sure. In the upper watershed, we've had some pretty bad turbidity events. And what a turbidity event is when soil gets mixed in with the runoff. So you can imagine after a wildland fire, like the Rim Fire, and the hillsides around the Tuolumne River are denuded because they burned off. And now there's no interception for the rain. Rain will hit the ground and take that soil that's been exposed through the wildland fire and bring it right to the river, causing the river to run black or brown. And we had another event besides Rim Fire at Moccasin, where we had a microburst. A very extremely violent storm where a single cloud basically sat over the Moccasin drainage and flooded it for an hour or so, causing the entire Moccasin fish hatchery to be flooded out.
Wow.
Many of the fish washed away into Don Pedro, which was to our benefit, I suppose, but it basically destroyed the hatchery. And you can imagine a torrential flood like that. What color is the water? It's brown. It's like chocolate colored because it's carrying so much soil with it. That's turbidity.
Okay.
And when that turbidity runs through the reservoir, it runs down at the bottom. It's heavier. And the reservoir, if you think about it, the reservoir is just a river that's been dammed up. And at the outlet, we're allowing water out to irrigate. We're allowing water out to generate electricity. Mm-hmm. We're allowing water out to the river below the dam constantly. So the reservoir, though it is a large body of water, really acts like a river. And that turbidity will sink. And the reservoir, mind you, is nearly 500 feet deep when it's full. And so you don't see that river of muddy water running through it. The reservoir might look beautiful, clear, beautiful green reservoir, but there's a muddy river running underneath. And if we don't realize that's coming, we could allow really muddy water into the lower river, which could be very disruptive to the trout and salmon below.
And so do we have an opportunity to prevent that from reaching the river?
We have a jet boat that has monitoring equipment with cables that run to the bottom of the reservoir, so we can monitor the depth and velocity of the turbid plume running through the reservoir. And then at the outlet, we have two main outlets. One is near the bottom of the reservoir where the turbidity would settle out and go through the tunnel to the lower river. And the upper outlet of the reservoir is about 250 feet off of the bottom. That's the one we use to generate electricity. And so we can feather the outflow up to the generation tunnel and bypass allowing turbidity.
It kind of sits below that level.
It does. It sits down below there. So we can allow clean, cold water out to the river below and kind of trap the turbidity in the reservoir to prevent any problems with the fishery below.
Sure. Okay. All right. And then one more question for you on kind of these elements that you monitor. Can you tell us about pH?
Yeah, pH has been a problem at many reservoirs around the state of California because if you have the proper pH, you can grow invasive snails and mussels that can plug up your works. They'll get into your outlet pipes where you're trying to generate electricity and fill the pipes, completely plug the pipes. We have a pretty high pH here at Don Pedro Reservoir, and so we can accommodate the adults of most of those species, those invasive species. So for instance, if a boater was fishing in San Luis Reservoir and he brought some quagga mussels into Don Pedro on his boat, the adults could fall off and live in Don Pedro, but they can't reproduce successfully. They need a different pH in order for the juveniles of their species to grow their shells. We don't support shell growth at Don Pedro for those invasive species. So fortunately, we don't have to maintain our pipes, our outlet pipes, by drilling through them or what have you through giant clusters of bivalves.
Okay. So you mentioned Don Pedro or our area, we have a high pH. That's a good thing to have a high pH?
It is. The basin plan for the San Joaquin Basin and tributaries requires that the pH be maintained between 6.5 and 8.5. And we're typically in the 7.5 range to 8. And so we meet the basin criteria.
Very good. Okay. So obviously there's a lot going on in our river system, a lot that has to be monitored and kind of kept tabs on to make sure that TID is determining our operations to be in the best interest of the health of the river. But let's move into a little bit more about kind of some of the other departments within TID that you work with to kind of impact or influence the operations around the district. Can you tell us about some of the other departments or divisions that you work with?
Sure, absolutely. One of the primary departments I've worked with over the years is the hydrology department. They're calculating how much water is coming into Don Pedro, how much is going down the canals, how much is being spent for electricity generation, hydroelectric, and how much we're putting down the river. And so keeping track of all of that is overwhelming.
It's a lot.
Fortunately, we have a great hydrology department doing an excellent job of calculating our different volumes, where they're going, where they're coming from. I also work with the civil engineering department quite a bit. For instance, out at Harding and Nielsen drains, where our canals gravity feed to the San Joaquin River, we've had salmon coming up into our canals. And so we've tried to mitigate that by designing outlet structures that prevent the salmon from getting up into the canals, because there's no good gravel for them to spawn in, and the canals are dewatered during the non-irrigation season. And so it's not a good place for salmon. We want them in the river. So we've worked together definitely to prevent salmon from getting up in the canals by engineering structures. I've also worked with the survey group a little bit here and there. Most of the time, the survey group is working on designs like the river restoration project that we're doing when they're working with the fisheries department. They do quite a bit of other work, of course. But when they're interacting with me, it's out surveying to make sure that we built a spawning bed properly. Does it have the right slope? Is it the right elevation in the river? And that sort of thing. In fact, they were out yesterday surveying a brand new spawning river.
Very good. Well, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the river restoration project. Let's talk about that, because you are heavily involved in that project. Tell us what's going on out there.
Sure. So most of the adult salmon coming up out of the San Joaquin River to spawn in the Tuolumne head right for the LaGrange Dam. That's where your coldest, freshest, most oxygenated water is, and your best cobble that we spoke about earlier.
Sure.
And so they all head right up there. And fortunately, we've been able to gain grant money and match that grant money, essentially, to reproduce what was at one time a great spawning and rearing habitat right below the dam. It's been damaged over the years, mostly by gold mining, 1849 to 1852. They had dredges in the river and they extracted all the spawning gravel out. So this year we're replacing 65,000 cubic yards of spawning gravel, which will also help with rearing in basically the first mile of the river. So right up where all the adult salmon would go, the healthiest place for the juveniles to rear. We're not just installing these riffles and gravel bars in the river, but large boulders the size of a table, big stuff. And 60 some odd trees are being put into the river. These are dead trees. They're being partially buried in the gravel. Their root wads are being buried, their stems are being buried, but the branches themselves will stick up into the water column. And you can just imagine the small branches where a juvenile fish could get in there and hide from predators. Also, the insects that they eat will graze on the decomposing bark of these buried trees. And so it provides a food source and a place to hide for juvenile fish. The large boulders that we're placing in the river will provide scour holes behind them. And so that's a fantastic place for large trout to hide behind and feed. And it also creates spawning gravel. So as you can imagine, as water flows down a river and hits a big boulder, it doesn't go through it. It goes around it. And then it wants to get back. The water wants to get back to where it was, so it scours a hole behind the boulder itself. And that gravel that is displaced becomes freshened, oxygenated, and free of debris because it's scoured out, and that's new spawning gravel for both trout and salmon.
Wow. So we're going back and correcting, we'll say, mistakes that were made back in, what did you say, 1849?
1849 to 1852 is so basically when they mined all the gravel out of the river.
Yeah, putting
all
that
the rivers
back
around here.
Sure, putting that back in, plus some, as you mentioned, the trees, the boulders, and kind of recreating this idyllic environment for the fish.
Absolutely.
Okay,
that's
very
what
cool.
we're up to right now.
Right on. Oh, that sounds great. All right, and I know through that project alone, you've been working with a number of different TID departments. As you mentioned, civil and survey. Any others that are active in that project?
Construction and maintenance.
Oh, okay.
So we've got crews out there running bulldozers and excavators and We even have gunite crews out there on one of the projects we're doing right at the base of the dam. And these guys are taking it to heart. It's a real pleasure to go to work every day and see these guys out there. They know that they're causing great benefit to the habitat and preserving our water rights at the same time. And they have been working so clean out there. You couldn't find an empty water bottle or anything out there where they're working. That's their river.
Yeah.
And they don't get to work in it very often. And this year they do. And man, they stand up straight. I'm telling you, they take a lot of pride in the work they're doing out there.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's created some great camaraderie and team. You know, I hear that team TID. Well, out there in the field, it's for real.
Awesome. That's so cool to hear. I love that. All right. So we've got this great river restoration project happening. What is your role on the project specifically?
So we actually have two projects going on the river right now. One of them is the Sluicegate project, which is occurring right there at the LaGrange Dam and Powerhouse. And what we've done there is we've removed habitat that was in jeopardy. So each time we would change our flow regime, we could dewater an area where there were salmon or trout habitating. And so we've created now a slip and slide channel where they can't be trapped in there any longer. And we've also constructed a large culvert that connects the flow coming over LaGrange Dam to the tail race channel, which is the outflow of the powerhouse, where we didn't have that operational diversity in the past. And now we can prevent fish from becoming dewatered.
Very good.
The other operation that we're conducting is the restoration, and that's about a mile long, and we spoke about the different habitats that we're creating with that project. Both of these projects require monitoring. Okay, so you can't just go in and disrupt the habitat of birds and turtles and fish and trees and shrubs without doing some monitoring. And so there are lots of different monitors, including archaeologists, because there are Native American artifacts out there that need to be preserved. So we have archaeologists, we have ornithologists, herpetologists. I'm a fish biologist. There's a lot of ologists out there.
A lot of ologists, wow.
My primary function for these restoration projects is to conduct water quality monitoring.
Okay.
So, for instance, if an excavator is working in the river and it creates a giant turbidity plume, which we spoke of earlier, I've got to stop him from working if he's creating a certain volume of turbidity. We can slow his work down, we can change his methods, but we have to work together to monitor and make corrections where needed.
Okay. All right. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit because there's another big program that you manage for the district that we haven't yet talked about. Tell me about the Salmonids in the Classroom project or program.
When I first started here, I think they had 4 classrooms that they had conducted this program in the past, and nobody was actively teaching it. Steve Boyd asked me if I wanted to take on a few classrooms, and I said, yeah. So he said, make it what you want.
Okay.
10 years later, I've got 38 classrooms, I believe now.
Wow.
Let me start from the beginning. The Salmonids in the Classroom program is a California Fish and Wildlife program, an educational program that's brought out to the classrooms where you set up an aquarium in the classroom with filtration and a chiller, and you instruct the students on the life cycle of salmonids. It could be salmon or it could be trout. And then eventually you acquire salmon or trout eggs from a local hatchery, put them in the aquarium, maybe go back and lecture again. Some of them ask for dissection, so I'll actually get a Chinook salmon from the hatchery and we'll dissect fish and go over anatomy and physiology. Well, once their eggs hatch, they rear them up in their classroom and begin feeding them about a month later, and they'll keep them for 2 or 3 months, and then we'll take them out to one of the local rivers and release them on a field trip where the kids can spend most of the day out on the river learning about Native American history, acorns, salmon, salmon habitat, foxes and skunks and predators like egrets and herons and osprey. And it's a wonderful day out in the field. I try to influence those kids not just about the salmon project, but I try and teach them about the reservoirs because that's what we do here. Steve suggested that to me years ago, and I thought, man, I'm going to run with that. So what are the 5 primary functions of Don Pedro Reservoir? Number 1, we prevent flooding. If Don Pedro Reservoir wasn't there, the city of Modesto would flood all the time. Wes Monnier and his hydrology department are working feverishly every time we have a couple wet water years and the reservoir gets full. They really have to work hard to prevent flooding in Modesto.
Sure.
Prevention of flooding. So these kids see photos of this. They see photos and video of 2017 flood releases and how close the water got to the houses in Modesto without getting their carpets wet.
Sure.
I also go into irrigation. And so I show them beautiful pictures of all the different types of crops we grow here, and the canals, the different types and sizes of canals that we utilize here to distribute the water from the reservoir down to the valley floor here so that we have virtually a Garden of Eden in the desert.
True.
I also show them the mini hydros, the large hydro plants where we're generating clean electricity with water. And I even have diagrams of the dam itself, the outlet tunnels that we spoke of earlier, and actual hydroelectric generation. So they're not just hearing it, they're getting to see images of all these types of things.
Awesome.
Also teach them about the recreation on the reservoir. We have campgrounds, houseboating, fishing. There are over 90 fishing tournaments at Don Pedro every year. So I encourage these students to get out there and go fishing, go camping with mom and dad, go to the reservoir, do the recreation. And then finally, I get into the salmon and trout.
Okay.
And I really spend a lot more time on the salmon and trout than anything else, but I make sure that they understand flood control, irrigation, hydroelectric generation, and recreation as well.
All the components.
All the components.
All the components. And what ages are these classrooms that you provide this program to?
I have second grade all the way up through high school.
Oh, wow.
And occasionally I'll go teach at the Rotary Club or other adult events where I've been requested. I also go to the fairs. I attend the Merced County Fair and the Stanislaus County Fair and set up a booth and teach about whatever topic they'd like related to fisheries. Sometimes I'll teach about fish farming in the Central Valley, something that most people don't realize is going on all around us. In the Central Valley, we raise sturgeon for caviar. We raise sturgeon for meat. We raise sturgeon to enhance the population. We raise largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, spotted bass, catfish, rainbow trout, bluegill.
Wow.
And a lot of these fish are actually the smaller ones like bluegill are raised in barns.
Barns?
You can be driving down the street past a barn and not realize it's a fish farm.
Wow.
Right?
Interesting.
The bigger fish are, of course, raised in ponds outdoors.
Sure.
But there are fish farms literally all throughout the Central Valley.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned sturgeon because there was another educational opportunity that you were involved with related to sturgeon. Tell us about that.
Yes. So the Great Valley Museum, which is a California Natural History Museum at Modesto Junior College, approached me and asked if I could help them set up a native fish display. And they wanted live fish, not just taxidermy fish.
Sure.
Fortunately, they had a beautiful 200-gallon aquarium, but no filtration, no lighting, no idea what to do.
Okay.
And so I went in and set up the aquarium, obtained the filtration and lighting and gravel and rock for them, native rock that we got adjacent to the Tuolumne River up in LaGrange. And so it looks just like the Tuolumne in that river. And then I went out to Sterling Caviar Farm in Sacramento and acquired some sturgeon for them.
Very cool.
So they have actually 3 sturgeon about 20 inches long right now, and they've been there at the museum for over a year. They eat pellets. They're really easy to keep, actually.
Wow.
And they are a beautiful representation of one of the most iconic species of California. They're a dinosaur virtually.
Huh. Very cool.
And they actually, last year or the year before, we had nearly 90 of them spawning in the lower Tuolumne River. They only come up about 2 miles from the San Joaquin. They only come in 2 miles down in the sand-bedded reach. They do their spawning and then go back out to the bay.
No kidding. I'll be darned.
I think the smallest ones are 6 or 7 feet.
Wow.
These are really big animals.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
That would be quite the surprise if you happen to be enjoying a day on the river in Modesto. Okay. And I know that career days at local schools throughout our area is something that you like to take advantage of, having that opportunity to talk with the kids and teach them about what you do.
I do. I get invited to, excuse me, please, several career days a year. And I like to go over all three of my careers. I know I represent TID, but I wouldn't be at TID if I wasn't first a park ranger and then working in forestry.
Sure.
And so I like to describe all those different careers with them. And some of the aspects of those careers that were just part of the career that could be a full career for somebody else, like firefighting, law enforcement, that sort of thing. And so I try and capture their attention and get them thinking about what they want to be.
Absolutely.
And so I always assign a homework assignment when I go to career days. I tell them, go home, go in the bathroom, close the door, and look in the mirror. Ask yourself, what do I want to be? Who am I?
Okay.
I hope that they take that assignment and do it.
Sure. Well, and you never know. Like your experience when you were 5 years old going fishing with your mom and your siblings, maybe you talking to kids in a classroom at a career day is the trigger they need to follow their path to fisheries. All right. Well, Pat, we've come to about the end of our time here. Is there anything we haven't covered or anything that you'd like to make mention of before we let you go?
I can't think of a thing. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time. I think this was fascinating. And again, as we said in the intro, probably a position that a lot of people don't realize we have employed here at TID. So
I've heard that over the years.
I bet. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.